Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into Civics Unfiltered. I'm Rafe.
And I'm Sophie, and every episode, we're taking a political issue that's dominating the news and break down what's actually happening, explain why people are disagreeing about it, and talk about what it means for everyday Americans.
So today's topic is one that doesn't get nearly as much attention as elections themselves, but it might actually decide what elections look like before anyone casts a vote. And we are talking about gerrymandering.
So, most people will hear that word every couple of years and just immediately tune out because it sounds really complicated. But the reality is that before voters can choose politicians, oftentimes politicians have a chance to choose their own voters.
And that's exactly why this matters, because over the past year, we've seen one of the biggest fights over congressional maps in decades and possibly our history. And states have been redrawing districts years before the next census, and courts have issued major rulings changing voting rights law, and both Republicans and Democrats have accused each other of trying to rig the system.
So, in today's episode, we're going to explain what gerrymandering actually is, why it's back in the headlines, what both sides are arguing, and how the outcome could shape who really is going to control Congress.
Perfect. So, starting, we're just going to give you guys an introduction of what gerrymandering really is. So, gerrymandering all has to do and revolves around congressional districts. So, if you're not really familiar with what a congressional district is, basically congressional districts determine who represents us in Congress. So, it's pertaining to the House of Representatives. And states get to draw these district lines in order to what they feel accurately represents a certain section. And that is why district lines matter, because states have the power, and obviously states are controlled by either Democrats or Republicans, and this is why we're seeing a lot of fights in recent times. So the first big example of gerrymandering that you guys should probably know about is packing. So packing does benefit Democrats mostly because when you think about it, a lot of these big metropolitan cities, like for example, LA or like Chicago or New York, and actually a big example of this is Salt Lake City too. State legislatures are kind of making these into a few different districts so that all of them can turn out Democratic, and it decreases the amount of competition in these districts. And why I was talking about Utah is because um there were multiple congressional districts in Utah that were up for kind of challenge in this election cycle in the midterms. And the Utah legislature actually made it so that Salt Lake City would have its own representative, which was pretty very heavily blue, um, which would eliminate all basically competition within the state. And then the other type that we need you to know is cracking. So this happens a lot with Republican legislatures trying to eliminate Democratic districts. So what they'll do is they'll split one big city into a few different districts so that the voters in that city are not enough to sway the other people in that district. So making it a usually Republican seat. And then this kind of ties into the argument of partisan and racial gerrymandering. So partisan gerrymandering is kind of just what I talked about, like Democrats or Republicans trying to sway um, seats in their favor. And then racial gerrymandering is oftentimes seen recently in southern states because a lot of typically Black people in those states tend to vote for Democrats. And if the state legislatures can eliminate seats that have um, majority Black people so they can make additional Republican seats, then that's what they're going to do. And that's what we're seeing with the Voting Rights Act, which we're gonna kind of get into in a little bit. But both parties have done both of these, and it's kind of just up in the air what's really the goal right now for both parties and what the outcome's gonna be. And we really have until November to see that.
Yeah, so gerrymandering, I'm sure as you guys gathered, has been a really contentious issue. It's really everywhere, which is due to a multitude of factors, but particularly because of recent court decisions and just extreme polarization that's really turned map drawing into this partisan power struggle. So, the 2026 House is expected to be very close. And, after court rulings, it weakened a lot of federal oversight, over gerrymandering, states like Alabama and Louisiana have been rushed and rushing to redraw their congressional districts in order to dilute Black voting power. So this has led to a lot of, headlines and just lawsuits and a lot of media coverage on gerrymandering, which is why you might see gerrymandering being more common in the news. Also, there's in a lot of states, it's been very, you've almost seen this like rush to redistrict. And this is due to a lot of things, like in New York and Virginia, we've seen Democrats really pushing for their own maps. They're arguing that they're fighting with fire. There was this whole thing in California, Prop 50, where we wanted to fight gerrymandering kind of with gerrymandering. And so it's become a really big issue with these states that are no longer waiting for the census. And so we're seeing this redistricting becoming a lot more common. In North Carolina, there's an empowered Republican majority, who's using this redistricting to turn competitive seats into like their own safe districts. And so we see that gerrymandering really could decide the House control before Election Day, and it could actually lead to an outcome before the actual election, which is something that is a little bit concerning, because the problem with gerrymandering is it always leads to less representation for one group. It's always going to disproportionately affect different people. And so that's the really
Yeah.
big issue. You get more representation for one people at the expense of others. And so that's kind of what gerrymandering is really based in. I mean, Texas was another really big issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for talking, like kind of giving like an additional like introduction to that. I thought that like that you what you guys really need to know is like the background of this before we kind of get into the example. So now I want to get into the example of Texas. So this has been a pretty big issue in the story, Sophie. I'm sure you've probably seen it. Like it's over everyone's like social media and everything. So so Texas was one of the biggest examples where gerrymandering was actually practiced. And so in Texas, they passed a new congressional map and they're expecting that it gives Republicans about 5 seats that they didn't have before. Um, and which is obviously their goal through this whole process is to get more Republican seats. And critics are calling it a racial and partisan gerrymander because we know that the demographics of Texas are like in certain areas, they're very different than other areas. Like, for example, in the southern border, you may find more people like of Mexican descent. And in cities like Houston, you may find more Black people. And then in other areas, you may find more white people. Like, it's a very diverse state, which is why they can use racial gerrymandering so easily, is because they can quickly divide their population into different sections that they know will vote one way. And then of course, I kind of touched on earlier, it's partisan gerrymandering as Republicans in the legislature are trying to get this passed. So actually, this map kind of has like a funny history. So a federal court first reviewed this and blocked the map, saying that it was unconstitutional. And then this case got passed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually did allow it to remain in place for the 2026 election. And we kind of expected this to happen when it went to the Supreme Court, considering that the Supreme Court is conservative, that there's 6 conservative justices. That makes a lot of sense, that they would pass something that would benefit conservatives in Texas. And this is going to reshape several White House, or this is going to reshape several House races, because it's going to make some less competitive as Texas is aware of how they can get districts to be safely red. Um, but Texas did push a little bit further than they probably should have to be safe. So some of these gerrymandered districts are still kind of in like contention and battle. So we're just going to have to see what happens with that. But Texas is one of the biggest examples of gerrymandering that we've seen for this election.
Yeah, so, okay, I want you guys to imagine for a second that you're a state and you see another state gerrymandering. Imagine just one state decides, we're going to redraw all of our voting maps and get more seats for our party. So they do this, okay? And other states, they're all watching this. And so they're obviously thinking, okay, well, if Texas can get away with this, then why can't we? So then what ends up happening is a domino effect. California, Florida, and all these other states are then going to respond, and then they're going to plan their own like aggressive map changes. And it just becomes a domino effect where state after state falls, and then suddenly the entire national map is just completely changed, even though most voters never moved places and their opinions really didn't change. And it just leads to this chain reaction where a few gerrymandered maps is really just creating this nationwide redistricting arms race. And this
It's
is really like,
crazy.
I know it's crazy and it's literally reshaping who's holding our power in Congress. But the voters didn't vote on anything. Like, they're not changing locations. It's all to do with this map drawing. And this is happening. And, at the same time, we see that the redrawing of these district lines is always drowning out certain communities, especially the young, diverse, and just the low income communities. We see their voices just being muffled and just overlooked. And so that's why the domino effect, like, really matters because yes, it's about maps, but it's also really about having representation for the people who aren't being spoken for. And we see that gerrymandering, it's not really allowing this representation for them. States like California, they approved maps after Texas. A lot of Republicans thought that this was retaliation. Maryland, like, they had their own meeting on redistricting specifically, and they're debating about it. And Georgia, they're pushing for new maps. And states like Alabama and Louisiana are literally trying to drown out minority representation. So we see that this is a really, big issue, and a domino effect obviously isn't good because gerrymandering is just, it's not a good thing, and it's gonna not allow people to be represented in the way that they really deserve to be represented by a democracy.
Exactly. And kind of moving on to what was like continuing in Louisiana, which was one of the biggest examples that we saw of how the Supreme Court affected what a district looks like. So we kind of need to give you guys a definition of what the Voting Rights Act is first. So basically just kind of what it was about was this was passed in 1965, so it is not anything new. And what it worked to do was abolish voting barriers. So it could be things such as like literacy rates or like poll taxes or anything like that. And these these divisions were used to disenfranchise racial minorities. So this would kind of make people like, for example, Black people, which I was talking about like in the South, there's a heavy concentration of them, and this kind of negatively affects them. So the Voting Rights Act allowed them to be represented by who they're actually voting for. And so now I'm going to get into the Supreme Court's decision on this. So this has been heavily reconsidered in recent times. So the recent case we saw about this was Louisiana versus Calais in the Supreme Court. And basically, Louisiana had two Democratic districts, and they thought that the Voting Rights Act was kind of preventing them from accurately representing like what they thought was like the legislature was accurately representing their population because they wanted more Republican districts. And the Supreme Court actually allowed and kind of repealed the Voting Rights Act. I think it was Section 2, which was the one that limited what I was talking about in the definition. So now it's harder to kind of challenge maps using race. And this is giving more power to the state legislatures rather than the demographics of the people that they're kind of drawing these districts for. And now we're going to kind of expect more lawsuits before November, as whenever the Supreme Court makes a decision, people are obviously going to feel half the country is going to feel one way, and mostly half the country is going to feel another way. And that's really important because we're going to expect a lot of lawsuits from governments. We've seen this with the Trump administration. People are suing them for even things that have nothing to do with gerrymandering. So this push by the Supreme Court to repeal this section of the Voting Rights Act is just going to inspire more fighting and cause a debate.
Yeah, I think that touches kind of on what I was talking about earlier about how there's less, federal protections, and there's been a lot more overturning of stuff that makes gerrymandering a lot easier. And so, with the prevalence of more gerrymandering, I think it really becomes almost a debate about what people are saying about gerrymandering, because when we talk about gerrymandering, of course, we're talking about the maps, but we're also talking about like who should have the power to do this in a democracy. So, on one side, we have critics saying that gerrymandering is really flipping the system, because historically, it's voters who are supposed to pick their politicians, not politicians who are supposed to pick their voters. So, with this gerrymandering, we have a lot less competitive elections, we have more safe seats, and we just have overall less accountability because incumbents don't really have to worry about losing to the other party, which means they also might feel a less need to really appeal to these kinds of people who they maybe don't have the same political beliefs as. And this also is really bad, specifically for minority communities, because they're losing real representation when they're cracked or packed into a single district. And so at the end of the day, we see that on the critic side, critics are really arguing that gerrymandering is just driving and worsening polarization and is rewarding, just not maybe the most democratic practices. On the other side, there is some support for gerrymandering. They think that, legislatures are elected to make redistricting decisions so that drawing maps is a part of their job. And they think that some communities, regardless of gerrymandering, may like lean towards one party, which is true. But so in spite of that, they think that sometimes these lopsided maps might actually end up reflecting what they really think. And they also think that, like, courts shouldn't be the ones drawing or heavily rewriting maps, because one of the big options was to have judges do this. But a lot of people say that judges aren't elected, so they shouldn't have the ability to draw these maps. So they think that both major parties should because that both of them can redraw maps, they think it's kind of like a fair game and it's anyone's game. So it's really kind of the key question that we all really need to be asking ourselves is if gerrymandering is a normal thing of politics or if it's something that is more of a way to rig it. That's kind of the really big question at the end of the.
Yeah. I think you touched on a lot. I think this debate is what we want to get you guys familiarized with so you guys can make your own stance on gerrymandering. So I'm wanted to get into why gerrymandering really matters. So a House majority is obviously a really big deal, as we know. It's basically half of the legislative branch, the other half being the Senate. And having the House majority could have a really big effect on a lot of these districts that were gerrymandered. And redistricting changes who actually has a chance of winning. I was talking about earlier in places like Utah where they kind of decreased the competition by giving Salt Lake City a seat that was Democratic versus when they had no Democratic seats earlier. It's just making things less competitive and it's kind of decreasing the nature of what politics really are. It's about, convincing your side and getting the votes, going out there and actually having initiative as the politician to go get votes. And when we see gerrymandering, that kind of just makes our democratic system a little bit different because people aren't competing for seats anymore. There's just it's just we know all of these people are going to vote for a Republican or all of these people are going to vote for a Democrat. So we don't have to have competition. And that's kind of not what we should be aiming for in democracy. We should be aiming for, civil debates and as I was saying, just convincing people of our side and then people can make their informed decision instead of just being forced to be under someone who they maybe agree with or maybe they don't. And influence and like legislation can be influenced on things like immigration, taxes, healthcare, climate, education. Like it goes way beyond that. And when you have someone representing you who, you were just kind of put into this box because you live in this area and maybe you don't agree with that and you couldn't really get the chance to, put someone up as a candidate to voice your opinion. Um, this is just a major detriment of gerrymandering on both sides for Democrats and like for Democratic legislatures and Republican legislatures because it's not giving people accurately it's not letting people get the representation that they want from the area that they live in. And this shapes politics for years. We're seeing Prop 50 until the 2030 election. That's another 4 years from now, and that's another three elections, including the one this year. And then we're seeing other ones that are more short term, like that are until just this year. But, these effects are still long term. The gerrymandering that we're seeing now is going to last us another 2 years until 2028. And the new Congress is not even going to take place until 2029. So these impacts are going to last us a very long time, whether we like it or we don't. And gerrymandering is going to go down in history as one of the most like corrupt practices that we have in our democracy. We're seeing support from the president to have Republicans get more seats because, a natural path that we see with the midterms is that the president's party usually loses the House and the Senate, the House and or the Senate. And Trump is just really focused on not wanting to lose that, as any president would. No president wants their party not to be in power. But, Democrats on the other side are also pushing because they don't think it's fair that Republicans can gerrymander and they are just left to face the consequences. So that's the questions that we kind of want you guys to think of. But some questions that we also wanted you to think of beforehand were, who draws congressional district maps today? So this kind of varies. So it can be state legislators. This is what's the reality in most cases. It can be independent commissions in other states, and then courts do step in if maps are illegal. And we saw this with the Supreme Court, with federal courts in Texas. We see this in many places. So the people who are drawing congressional maps really varies, and you can't just point to one party or just even the state legislature, honestly, because um just because a governor pushes something like in Virginia, they had the resolution to gerrymander and it got approved by the majority of their population. So it did pass. But then the Supreme Court of Virginia actually struck that down. So they're back to where they started again. So just because there's gerrymandering or there's not gerrymandering doesn't mean that this was by a state legislature. And the second thing we want you guys to think about is that both parties do contribute to gerrymandering. For this election cycle, we did see it stem from the Republican side, but Democrats have definitely retaliated on this point. They've made it really clear that they don't stand for unfairness, and Republicans are continuing to fight back because they don't want Democrats to overpower them, which makes a lot of sense. They want equal representation in Congress. Even though that they did start the redistricting, they don't want um, Democrats to overpower them and vice versa. So both parties can definitely agree that even though they are redistricting, the net benefit, both parties really want that to be the same. And so you can't just point a finger to one party for gerrymandering because as I just said, it's on both sides of the aisle. And people want to favor their own party, which is like kind of the lesson we want you guys to take from this. People want their own party to be in power. But the democratic processes of things is to have people vote for things and not have governments try to suppress and change that.
Yeah, so, obviously we see gerrymandering as kind of this cycle. One party does it, the other party feels like they then have to do it in order to kind of make things fair again, which just leads to an endless cycle of gerrymandering, which is kind of what we've touched on. So that was really great. But, at the end of the day, there's really two big questions that me and Rafe want to leave with you guys, the audience, today. And the first one is that, do you think that it's fair for politicians to be able to draw the districts that they'll eventually run in? And the second one is that, if one party is going to redraw the maps to gain a certain political advantage, is it then fair for the other party to go do the same? Or should one party break the cycle? These are kind of the two big questions when it comes to gerrymandering. And we're really grateful that we were able to kind of touch on this really important topic today.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. I think that you guys really need to consider a lot with gerrymandering. And now that you're more informed on it, I think you can make decisions based on what you've seen on social media or what you think is right and what's not right. So For material and content, that is all we have for you guys today. We really appreciate your time in listening to us, but of course, the thing that we want to stress most at the end of the day is that voting is what actually makes the difference. You guys are the change makers, and voting getting registered to vote is the biggest thing you can do, and actually voting in these midterms is the biggest thing you can do. People are going to try to pass more gerrymandering. This is not the end of it, definitely. Just the 2026 cycle is just probably the beginning of what we're going to see a lot of in the future. And we want you guys to take away that the biggest thing is voting. So, thank you guys so much for listening to our podcast today, and
We
we
really
hope to see you
appreciate
in the
it.
next episode. Yeah, we really appreciate you guys. We will see you in the next episode, and we'll hope to have more interesting content available for you guys. So, thank you so much for listening, everyone. Bye.